the mics. So at this point, Annette Bergeron, President of PEO, Professional Engineers Ontario, is going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much. So about this conference, I'm thrilled to be here. Here's a quote. "We know that for big issues such as the economy, climate change, poverty, innovation, and healthcare, we still look to the government for help and solutions. The problem, of course, is that governments don't always have the answers, and we know they can't solve these problems on their own. But more than ever, partnerships and collaboration are required, and this is where public engagement becomes important." So here's a passage from the foreword to Rescuing Policy, The Case for Public Engagement. This is the latest book by Lenihan, and who's our next keynote speaker. So not only does Rescuing Policy introduce the topic of public engagement and a roadmap for change, but it also provides the impetus to rethink the entire public policy process. So Don is a senior associate with Canada's Public Policy Forum in Ottawa, to which he readily applies his more than 25 years of experience as a project leader, writer, speaker, senior government advisor, trainer, and facilitator. So known around the globe for his expertise on democracy and public engagement, accountability, and service delivery, Don is leading an 18-month province-wide public engagement initiative for the Government of Ontario to renew the Ontario Condominium Act from 1998. His co-authored paper, Co-Design, A New Vision for the Government of Australia, chronicles a community approach to service delivery. So not only did Australia use the paper to create a pilot project for all 3 levels of government, it engaged Don as the project's senior advisor and writer. So Don is also very active in Canada. In 2007-2008, for instance, he advised the government of New Brunswick on public engagement matters and developed pilot projects for a public engagement policy. So a workshop he delivered to 40 officials in Nunavut in 2009, along with planning sessions, discussions, and further projects over 2 years, helped craft a poverty reduction process for the territory. And of this fascinating project, he wrote, and I quote, "Participants often seem to link healing and well-being to a greater sense of control over the decisions that affect their communities and their families. Many Inuit seem to be saying that while they want government that can make decisions and act in the community's interest, they also want government that challenges and allows the community, its organizations, and people to solve their problems together." So earlier in his career, Don founded the Center for Collaborative Government, and he has served as Director of Research at the Institute of Public Administration in Canada. He has also been Director of Research and Editor of The Network. It's a national publication on national unity and constitution issues. So Don is a former columnist with Ottawa Hill Times newspaper, and he writes a regular column for iPolitics. He has a BA in philosophy from Victoria University, an MA in philosophy from Brock University, and a PhD in political theory from the University of Ottawa. So please join me in welcoming Don Lenihan.
Thank you very much, Annette. First of all, let me say I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to talk to you about some of these things, public engagement in particular. I'd also say Steve Paikin is a pretty hard act to follow. But let me give it a try. And I want to start by just saying a word or two about what I think I'd like to do and maybe pick up on some of the themes that Steve himself raised. I guess I have some slides here. Yeah, there. Okay, we are. I really found it interesting what he had to say about Kathleen Wynne in particular, and 2 things stood out in my mind. He talked about, first of all, the conversations being one of the words that's being a buzzword right now around Queen's Park. And I want to talk about conversations, or as I like to say, dialogue, because I think dialogue really is an important part of what we're starting to think about public policy and the public policy process. I think the other thing I found interesting was what he talked about, the tension between policy and politics, which has always been there. But I guess I'm going to want to suggest that not only is it the case that under a minority situation, governments are more political than they might be under a majority situation. That's probably true. But I think increasingly, for interesting reasons, the politics are kind of going wild on us. And we're asking ourselves, what's going on? So what I'd like to talk to you about today is really understanding the policy environment. And a bit like Steve, he's given us a sort of sketch of the last 40 years. I want to stand back to and take you on a little bit of a journey, if I can use that hackneyed metaphor, and look back at what's happened to public policy. Where were we 30 or 35 years ago? Why did it seem to make more sense to us? What's happened in the intervening years, and what does it mean for us today? And I'd like to save some time, of course, at the end for some questions and thoughts from you. So I'll try to get through my little story here as quickly as I can, but you'll have to bear with me. I've got lots of pictures. They may or may not interest you or may not entertain you. But so understanding the new policy environment. Have I got this right here? Let me go back 30, 35 years. I'm not sure what it would be. Can you hear me fine there when I step back?
Yes.
All right. The traditional model of the public policy process, let me just give you a thumbnail sketch of the way it worked for 150 years around the world and worked pretty well for us. You see the picture here of two hands handing off the file. More or less, we understood public policy and the process as something that happened inside government. And there were two big institutional players. There were the politicians and the public servants. The public servants were seen as being the experts, and lots of them were. 25 years ago, if you were a deputy minister in agriculture in one of the departments, you probably were in that department for 25 or at least 15 years. You probably knew as much about agriculture as just about anybody around. Today, they're shifting like crazy. But what happened is we saw the public service as providing the policy expertise and the options to government, and the task for politicians was to make the choices. And by and large, it worked pretty well. It worked pretty well. What happened? I want to say that today we are living in a new policy environment. The reality is we don't know what to do, and I'm going to explain what's happened to the policy environment. What we do know is the old model is not working the way it used to. And if you talk to anybody, there's nobody that knows this better than public servants, is they're constantly complaining about what happened to our role as advisors to governments. The advice we give is often not heard, it's not listened to, and politicians, on the other hand, say the advice we get from public servants really isn't relevant to the policy environment we're living in. What happened to public servants that used to give us options that we could really deal with? So I want to talk to you about three things. I want to look back and sort of say, what's happened, the big sort of really big context, the drivers of change over the last 30 years around our world, and none of these will surprise you, but it's important to see what are the big drivers that have been moving the world around us. Secondly, how has that impacted on the policy environment? What does it mean for people who are now trying to make public policy? And lastly, what does that mean for the challenge and the process for the future? And how do we deal with that new environment more effectively? So the drivers of change, and I'm going to just identify three fairly quickly. None of these will surprise you. First and foremost, or maybe no particular order, I should say, demography. The reality is we've got here, and in most of the, certainly the developed world, an aging population. We know that as a matter of course, people are getting older. Our birth rate isn't what it used to be in the past. That has all sorts of implications for governments and for others. It means we have a shrinking labor force. We have interesting other consequences. Young people who are coming up, we find, are not engaged in the same way. But one of the big changes or impacts on us surely is demography. And I will come back to this later. Secondly, the shift from rural to urban. And as engineers, this won't surprise you at all. If we look back 30 or 40 years ago, the kind of society we had, let alone 50 years ago, and the kinds of problems it raised when we were much more rural, we had smaller cities, far less concentrated populations, it was just a different world. One of the projects I'm working on right now is the renewal of the Condominium Act in Ontario. You guys who live in Toronto know what the waterfront looks like. There are now 1.2 million people in Ontario living in condominiums. And my guess is in another 20 years, we're going to find out that a significantly larger percent of the population does. So the shift from rural to urban raises all kinds of new policy issues, all kinds of new problems around transportation, around education, around density of population, all the things that particularly as engineers you ought to be interested in. Thirdly, and not surprisingly, digital technologies. The last 30 years have changed fundamentally the world we live in. If anything has, if we look back, if I were a historian 30 years from now and look back at this period and said they're living through or we're living through a period of great change, and somebody said, what happened? my answer would be the internet happened. And it fundamentally changed the way the whole world was organized. It supported globalization. It supported a whole range of transformations. We now know we're entering the age of big data. We don't really know what that means yet. We just know that it means we're going to have information like we've never seen. We're not sure how we're going to deal with that. So these are three really big drivers, and I just want to set that out there. To go back to some of the things that Steve was saying, as I was listening, I kept thinking, all this stuff is happening in the background, and what does it mean for people who are making public policy? So let me ask what the impact of this has been if you're in the public policy world. And remember that traditional model that used to be a nice relationship, a relatively, I don't want to say cozy one, that sounds inappropriate, but a relatively close relationship between public servants and politicians about how we got an agenda and what problems we dealt with and how we made decisions. How has it impacted on that? And I want to say three things. There's probably five, but I'm going to stick to three now. Three really powerful changes that I think put us into an environment that I would just describe as congenitally unstable. The first is the rise of interest groups. And over the last 30 years, whether it's associations like your own, this organization itself, all kinds of advocacy groups, lobbyists, just the organization of, if you like, the broader public policy community has exploded. And we now have a whole bunch of people and organizations who are well organized, informed, well resourced in lots of cases, and very active in the policy field. And go back to that traditional model and think about those two forces of public servants and politicians. Now you've got a much more complex, much more engaged, much more informed and well resourced policy arena out there. And folks, that's not going away. And that's not a bad thing. In itself, there's nothing, in fact, in itself, I would argue this is a good thing. We want an informed, engaged society. But the immediate impact has simply been the rise of relatively focused interest groups like your own, appropriately, who want to say, how do we get our stuff on the agenda? So we've got a lot of voices out there all sort of saying, how do we get our stuff on the agenda and what do we do? Complexity and interdependence. I've heard somebody else, I think, mention this in the questions. I think personally this is one of the most powerful consequences for policy that there is. We used to see the policy world and policy issues in relatively simple terms. We had departments of agriculture and industry and various things. We still do, but almost nobody who works in a department believes that there's a policy space now and that your issues are essentially spaced in there and you can sit back and say, what are the implications for agriculture? What we know right away is as soon as you start to talk about an issue, it floods over and connects up with all kinds of other issues and areas and levels of government and interest groups and so on. Let me give you one example. Think about the pipeline debate right now. If we'd had the pipeline debate, and there was a famous one in the 50s, 30 or 40 years ago, whichever pipeline you have in mind, by the way, there's 2 or 3 of them we're talking about, we would have seen this in relatively simple terms. Maybe, I'm not even sure we would have seen it as an environmental question back then, but we would have probably seen it as some technical issues, some cost issues, some jobs and economic development issues. We know today that if you raise an issue about are we going to build a pipeline, we're not just talking about all those issues in their immense complexity. We're starting to talk about lifestyles, impact on Aboriginal peoples, a whole range of other issues, even issues around well-being, around our health, that are impacted on this, and suddenly they crowd into the public policy space. And that means if you're trying to debate this stuff, ultimately you find every issue gets connected to every other issue. How many of you have heard of the expression wicked issues? A wicked issue, it's a British expression, I love it. It really just means issues that effectively, they're wicked in the sense that you used to think you could talk about this problem and talk about these 2 or 3 solutions, and now suddenly you find this solution is connected to this solution is connected to this solution, and the thing just starts to expand and explode on you, and you just sort of find yourself lost in this policy space. And most of our issues now are increasingly wicked issues. Finally, I just want to say the focus on results. I could spend more time on this, but I want to make it very brief. The focus on results is just to say this, is about 20 years ago, and I remember when some of this was happening, we suddenly realized that as the world was getting more complex on us, that public servants and politicians, our public policy officials, weren't really thinking much about the outcomes. And we certainly weren't measuring for them of public policy. We actually didn't know a lot about what happened when we used our programs and our services and our policies and launched them out there into the world. They had a whole bunch of impacts and we had almost no information on data on that. We rarely even actually defined what the outcomes were. And somebody came along and said, wisely, gee, wouldn't it be good if we knew what actually was happening out there and decided whether or not our public policies and our options were useful on the basis of outcomes. We began to measure for outcomes in the last 20 years, only the last 10 or 15 really, and we're still in the infancy here, folks. We don't know much at all about how our stuff impacts on the world. And that's a huge part of the future. How many of you out there think we should know and measure and follow the outcomes that our policies and our programs deliver? Show of hands. How many don't? Wouldn't you want to know? I mean, you guys in engineering surely will know that. You want to know if you're going to build something, is it going to fall down? Is it going to serve the purpose? We're really in our infancy on this, but it is a hugely important part of the future. If we want to do evidence-based policy, we've got to know what it is we're trying to achieve and what it is that's impacting on the world, and we don't know how to do that hardly at all. Finally, let me just say this. Here's the really big change, and I think this goes to the conversations metaphor that Steve raised, is if you look at these impacts on the environment, the idea that we have now a way more elaborate, complex public policy environment with all sorts of conversations and people active in it, the fact that it's enormously complex, issues are spilling over into issues, the fact that we don't really know a lot about how our policies and programs impact on the world. The one thing I think this does tell us that I think is becoming more and more important is that ultimately we can't do this in the way we used to. We can't simply make policies inside a small space called government and suddenly throw them out there and expect them to solve the problems. Is that the policy issues are now so complex and the range of players involved is large enough that we've got to change the fundamental way of doing policies. We can't just do it on command and control. We can't just ask somebody to make a decision, and that's what government decision makers are supposed to do, to solve a problem. And the reason is they aren't in control of a whole bunch of the resources and so on that will impact on the problem. If we want to solve a problem, increasingly what's going to happen is we need to get a range of players working together because the problem is complex and the solution is complex. And that means government can be a very important player in that. But government is not the sole decision maker. Government is not the sole holder of solutions. And I think if there's any single thing we're struggling with right now, and I find this interesting, what Steve had to say about Kathleen Wynne and conversations and so on, it's that we're still looking to governments to solve our goddamn problems. They can't do it on their own, folks. All of us are going to be implicated in this, and that brings us to a whole very different conception of government. Our conception of government is very closed, very hierarchical, very command and control. We look to them for answers. They offer us answers. We give them our votes, and we expect to find a solution. Sorry, that's the problem. That's the problem. So what's the challenge? Simple, folks. Used to be that there were two big players in the space. Let's call them the public service and governments or elected officials. That's how the system worked more or less. I'm oversimplifying, but it'll do for our purposes. And it worked really well, more or less. That's why we had the kind of stability. We lived in a different world. We don't live in that world anymore. Our institutions are still there. They're still trying to work with that model. There's a great big player out there, and you're a part of it. Let's call it the public policy space. At least it's all those interest groups, and I'd say it's even the larger context of the citizens themselves. When we start thinking about social media and all kinds of other forces that are engaging us now, it's the whole world. And I don't make this unmanageable. We're going to talk about that. What I do want to say is that the public policy space and the public policy process has to be redefined in a way that allows that third space, the public, in more or less, depends on the times and the space, but sometimes you guys, sometimes others, sometimes smaller, sometimes less, but not just these two players, and not only on developing the policies, but on delivering them, because we can't do it alone ourselves. We need a more collaborative arrangement. We need a conversation. We need to recognize it's not just government's problem to solve. Government is a key player, but government is not the only one. It can't be. So let me just talk a tiny bit about the difference between the kind of public process we've had and the kind of public policy process we need. I've written a whole book on these next 3 slides, so I'm trying to pack here into about 5 minutes what I'd like to tell you in, I usually do this in a day-long seminar, but I'll give it to you in 5 minutes. Let's call this the very short elevator version. First of all, the traditional public policy process, when it involves more than just than just bureaucrats and elected officials, the public has been brought into public policy all the way through, down in the past. But here's the way we did it. I don't know if I can step away from my mic. Can you hear me if I step away from my mic? No? Okay. If you look at these three different stages, the traditional public policy process has 3 stages in it. So what I call the views, sorry, let me qualify that and say, when the public service and the politicians couldn't solve the problem internally, in other words, they felt they did need to consult, and I'm going to underline the word consultation, consult with the public. Here's the way that we've traditionally done it, and by and large still do, when we need the public involved in a public policy decision. There are 3 stages in the process of what we call a consultation process. The first stage is the views. And what we do as governments is we rent a room like this. They'll hire someone like me or send the minister out, and the minister will pose a question, sit at the front of the room up here, put up some microphones, invite you guys in, and tell you to come up to the microphones, and we'll say, here's our question, here's what we're consulting you on. Tell us what you think we should do. We're going to consult, right? And I'm making it simple and graphic here. This can happen online with surveys. It can happen through a telephone survey. It can happen as a big, large process across the country. It could be in one room. But the basic model is this, is we go and ask the public to give us their views on what we think that they think is the solution to the problem. And then when we've got their views, when you've spoken at the microphone, we send you home. And what government does then is it goes behind closed doors and it takes all that information, if it's doing it well, and it deliberates on what you had to say. Ideally, it balances those things out. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm sure there's some people out there thinking, yeah, I bet. But let's just be generous here and say, in an ideal world, they take your views and they balance these things out and they try to figure out, essentially like a judge would, what's the best sort of evidence given the arguments you've made, and they deliberate over that, they balance it out, they try to arrive at the best solution, and then when they do that, they develop what I would call an action plan, which is simply to say, what's the government going to do about this now that we've decided what we think the solution is? And they formulate a plan, a program, some regulations, whatever it may be, based upon the deliberations they did internally. And when they've got that action plan or those recommendations into a report, they give it back to government. And the minister stands up and says, now the ball is in government's court, now government will or won't act on this. So the process is really simple. Your role in the process is to come up and give your best arguments about what you think government should do to solve this problem. And notice, by the way, remember all those interest groups, you're not likely to be the only people at the microphone. You're going to be competing with a whole bunch of other people who are getting up there saying, I think we should do this, I think we should do this, I think we should do this. Here's the problem. Here's the problem. In fact, let me ask you, anybody see, given what we've said so far, what's the problem with this process, given the way we've sketched the world? And there's no circle back, and even, that's absolutely right, and even further, he stepped away for a second. At the end of the day, who's the actor in this model? Who owns the problem? Government. Who owns the solution? Government. But if you buy my basic argument, and maybe you don't, in which case I may be wasting your time and mine, that the world is no longer so simple that these problems are going to be solved by government, we're putting ourselves into a process that actually prevents us from finding the solution because we hand the problem back to government. And the process itself tells us to do that. The process is designed to ask you for your views, then send you home and deliver the responsibility to government to solve the problem. And then you get really mad when government doesn't solve the problem, and then the politicians stand up and try to explain why they couldn't solve the problem, and we get in this vicious circle. I think lots of what Steve was talking about is explained very simply by this. No one knows more than politicians that they can't solve these problems. I talk to ministers all the time, and they just keep telling me, why can't I get up and tell people I can't solve that problem? I once talked to a senior member of the Ontario government, who shall remain unnamed, as he's still a senior minister, and he said exactly that to me. He said, and I said, well, why don't you just go out there and say it? Just say, you know what, I can't solve this problem. You know what he said to me? His answer to me was, he looked at me and said, you know what? He said, I'd like to do that, but if I do, the guy on the other side of the house is going to get up and say, you know what, I can. And guess who's going to get elected next time around? We're still buying into the model that they will sell us the solution and we will purchase it with our votes and they will go out and solve the problem, except they won't, and then they'll have to figure out what to do at the next election to explain that away, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So here's what I want to say to you, is we've got to change the basic process. Our basic assumption is this is not a collaborative way of doing policy development or policy delivery. It doesn't solve our problems, and that's our problem, or certainly a big part of our problem. And the fundamental of the change to the process has really, I'm going to jump to the third slide, or just jump right ahead, is something like this, is that we need to bring you guys, the public, sometimes that's stakeholders, sometimes it's the general public, sometimes it's both. And we can talk more about that in questions and answers about how big these processes may or may not need to be, sometimes small, sometimes big. But it depends on the problem. It's just to say that third dart, that red-colored dart, that the public, instead of sending them home after we get their views, we do want to hear what you have to say, but now we're going to get you in a circle, go back to Kathleen Wynn's conversation, and instead of sending you home after you've given us your views, we're going to get you guys who are giving us your views to start having a discussion with each other. And government is going to facilitate and participate in that discussion, but it's not the only player. And what we're really going to say here is, all right, instead of getting our bureaucrats and our politicians to do the deliberation in secret or in silence or in somewhere behind closed doors in the boardroom, we're going to do it out here in public, and we're going to do it together. So you and you and you and you who are around the table are going to start answering to each other. You're going to hold each other to account for what you say. It's not just government holding you to account or you holding government to account. It's a public policy process that we all own, and we're going to say, you know what, get real about your solutions, because we're going to have to do this together. And if we do that, then we get to another stage where we say, all right, you know what, we've done a reasonably good job of finding essentially what we think is a balanced solution that addresses all of our interests. Now we're going to have to actually pay up the piper. Because the bottom line is the reason you're at that table is you have a genuine and invested interest in that problem, and it's in your interest to solve it. You may already be spending resources and things towards it. So how do we develop a plan, including government, but government is one of the players, which all of us have a role to play? How do we coordinate our actions in a meaningful way to get a bigger bang on our buck? How do we look for the outcomes and results that we all want and figure out how we align our resources and our activities to, instead of fragmenting them and scattering them across God's green earth, that we actually focus together on an action? Collaboration is not just having a common interest. It starts with a common interest. Ultimately, collaborative policymaking is about having a shared plan on a common interest. And getting to that plan is what we really need to do. The process has to change. And I guess I would argue to you, to go back to some of the things Steve said this morning, I think this talk, I think what is healthy is the talk that we're hearing about conversations and deliberation and dialogue. That's where I think we're trying to get to. And we're doing some interesting pilot projects and experiments, and nobody's got this perfect. I was in Australia doing stuff. I've been other places doing stuff. I think around the world, people are sort of saying, we've got to change the process. But we're still very much in the traditional model, and our political culture is still selling us solutions. There aren't simple solutions to complex problems. That's what we have to figure out. And that means no single party is going to solve the problem for us. So how do we get somewhere else? Let me just say one last thing about this, is that the reality is, if we're talking about complex problems and we get to a process like this, it's going to be cyclical. You're not going to solve a problem like poverty or pipelines or whatever it may be in one process with one action plan. Ideally, what happens in a process like this is it becomes more of a way of doing business within some stakeholders and governments within the policy field, and that we actually go through a process where we do some views and deliberation and action, and then we evaluate what we've learned and how much progress we've made together, and we do it again. And that way we begin to build up a collaborative relationship based upon past experience, based upon success, based upon evaluation, and increasing levels of trust in our ability to work together to achieve more effective outcomes. We start small. We don't have to start big. But if we start small and we do it well once, the second time gets a lot easier, and the third time gets even easier, because not only do we know each other and trust each other, we realize that we're all better off for doing it that way. So I guess I want to stop there and just open it up. I think there's about 15 minutes left for some questions and answers, and hopefully I've given you enough of a picture to see where I'm going, and I'd be happy to reply to anything you've got to say.
Hi, my name's Andrew Wisnowski, and I'm also from Ottawa. So you may know that we've been having a bit of a bridge debate there recently, and I've been involved, not through work, but through volunteer activity in this kind of new dialogue, that there was a process that delivered unto Ottawa the new bridge sort of alignment. You may remember there was a meeting a few years back at Lansdowne Park where 3,000 people were essentially yelling BS at the panel at the front of the room, which included a whole bunch of engineers. And so the problem was handed over to the National Capital Commission, and they recommenced the public engagement process, which I would say most of those who were involved with it just felt that it was a cynical attempt to deliver a new public engagement process with a predetermined solution already in place, and with the process that really just described your first traditional version. It was touted to be this, but it really didn't become that. And lo and behold, the NCC just submitted their final adjudication, and it's the same alignment that was proposed 3 years ago. And the public is essentially outraged. So,
and rightly so.
Well, what's the way ahead, I guess?
Well, let me just say this. I mean, I don't have any simple answer for this. Here's what I will argue, and maybe you'll think I'm exaggerated and send me home. I just think we don't have a lot of choice. And I do think we're still in that big space of transition. I thought it was interesting listening to Steve again. Steve, and I credit him for this, is still looking for patterns back there. Is the stuff today going to be like the stuff before? My answer is no. No, we're in a different world now, folks. But here's what is going to happen, one of two things. Either we're going to figure out how to do this differently, or we're not. And if we don't, I don't think the consequences are good. I'm not sure where that takes us, but it means we will not be able to solve big policy problems effectively. My big fear in looking at politicians right now is exactly what you're saying, is because they are still playing the game the old way. They are still selling solutions and trying to make internal decisions and trying to hang on to that model, is that what happens is they make us increasingly cynical about the opportunities for dealing with the problems we have. And not only that, you'll notice they become less and less and less willing to take on big problems because they know there are so many of you guys out there standing on the front line screaming as organized players and interest parties that they don't want to deal with big issues. So they just start dealing with little issues and the big problems don't go away. My short answer to you is to say this. All I can say is that some of us are trying to convince both the political and public service level, and there are lots of people on both sides beginning to think this way. We just can't do business this way. And if you take the options that we do have and make people cynical about them, we'll be in really serious trouble. What I want to hear, and I loved what I heard Steve saying, I'm not trying to, by the way, it sounds like I'm hot on Kathleen Wynne. I'm not. I'm just sort of saying, I liked what he was saying about this. Is she's actually saying, you know what, I got to take the bull by the horns. That's what I want to tell a politician. Don't start lying one more time. Get up there and tell them you can't do it. You're going to have to, I can't do it alone. You're going to have to be part of this, and it ain't going to be easy, folks. And it's not easy for politicians to do that. They're not rewarded for it. Or maybe we'll find out that we do start rewarding them for that, and that would be a good thing because then maybe they'll do it. So I don't have a simple answer, except we're going to go one way or the other. We're at a fork in the road.
Okay, are we on? Thank you. I've got a question. I'm also from Ottawa, and sort of a perception of, it's partly a question, partly an observation on the cycle here. The collaboration, the cycle of feedback and making decision. I see this in the context of people who have some stability, they're in planning. Public service is a good example of people who can and should be doing this. When it comes into the politics and making the big things happen, the problem I see with this model is that politics is short. It works to the next election and so on. And if we collaborate or we re-collaborate, or in the case of Ottawa, we get a change of government or a change of personnel and so on, all of a sudden the re-collaboration goes off in another tangent and we can stall and we can deliberate forever, or in some cases waste a lot of money. At some point decisions have to be made, and I think, you know, in the model as we take it, you collaborate, but at some point you gather the information, you make a decision, and you move fruitfully on, making the best of what may not be a 100% solution. And that seems to be something that doesn't work in government, and I'd like to get your commentaries on that observation.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a lot of time to talk to it. I'll give you my short, sort of abbreviated answer here. First of all, let me just say this, is that to go back to the old model, politicians are rewarded and have been rewarded for working in a 4-year framework. And I go back to what I said about our need to do way better results-based planning. And as we get better at this, we will be looking at measuring for and tracking long-term cycles on big issues that have milestones. The simple answer to your question is we will reward, and I've seen it happen, politicians for milestones. Two things are at issue here. If I were a politician getting up, I wouldn't say, I'm going to solve poverty. I'd be saying, as we did in Nunavut, we're going to take a step on this, and there's a long-term goal that we're setting, but here's what our milestones are in our mandate. And it's going to take us through a whole cycle, and we're going to get there in 4 years. And we're not going to solve everything, but at the end of the day, let me tell you what we're going to deliver with you. And if you re-elect us, then we're going to go around again. The second thing that happens is as you build these processes increasingly don't belong to government, they belong to the public, because you guys are invested in them, you're participating in them, you're investing your resources in organizing, and no government in their right mind that comes in is going to blow that up. What they're really going to do is try to put their stamp on it, and that's fine. They're going to come in and say, you know what, on the next round of this, let me tell you how we'll make it better for you than they will. And that would be a good and healthy debate to have. So here's my short answer. We've got to figure out how to reward them for thinking and talking long term. And we can do it. The possibilities are definitely there. Yes?
McAllis from Sudbury. I spent some 30 years in the Ontario Public Service, so I know that system quite well. I want to challenge an observation you made at the beginning of your speech, that politicians no longer listen to the public service. Is that true for the federal government? And I hear that from my federal colleagues. But is it true on the provincial level across the country? Are some public services more organized, more...
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And having said that, some issues perhaps need this very large, elaborate consultation, but other issues, perhaps, if you create the snowball, hand it to the public servant that then provides it as part of the advice that you give to the elected officials, it may get tossed. So perhaps one size doesn't fit all in terms of all the issues we have?
Absolutely right, both. Let me say something about both. First of all, let me say that different public services they can be really quite different. And particularly size matters, right? It's not just size. Size matters, ideology matters, temperament matters, all sorts of things about culture. Having said this, I'm quite willing and will stand by the generalization that in almost any government, and I work with them all around the world and certainly across this country, in almost any government now, the general and increasing view is, to go back to my first slide about the two hands handing off the folder. I think what most people on both sides of that, political and public service, will agree with is that model on its own is no longer, it's not workable. So that means public servants may not be complaining that they're not listened to. What they will be saying is, we don't have all the answers, and we're going to have to figure out how to do this process differently. And I just would say this, is I think some governments are more open to that than others, and the tensions between the public service and the political level are different because of the internal attitudes and dynamics and all that stuff. But all of us are struggling with the problem. What was your second question again?
There are some issues that perhaps need this model, and other issues, you know, PEO creates the snowball, gets all of the briefing notes done, gives all the good logical reasons behind a particular policy decision, hands it to the public service that then provides it with other advice, perhaps, but then
if I had time,
essentially different kinds of solutions. To
and if I had time,
problems.
I would tell you, I would argue this at length. This is what I argue in my book and my course is, there are three kinds of issues. Not everything is a public engagement issue.
Okay.
There are issues that are internal and sort of what we would call not wicked issues, right? There are what I would call deliberative issues, which is a second process, and there are what I would call public engagement issues, or whatever you want to call them. There's three different kinds, and I think we can block, like I would argue there are three fundamental kinds of processes, and basically they map onto three different kinds of issues. I've mainly been focusing here on the ones that are the big, complex, wicked ones, and there are lots of them out there, because they're the ones that are really going to get us in the end if we don't learn how to deal with them. There are still lots of issues, folks, that can be and are solved internally. There's some that are solved by just more deliberation without collective action, and then there are this third kind. The last thing I want to say is there's even a rule for deciding between them. It would take me longer to explain this, but the basic rule is this, is there are two questions you have to ask to define a problem. One is, can we actually define the problem in a way that everybody will agree with? Or do people start disagreeing just on our definition of the problem? And the second thing is, once we have a definition of the problem, is the solution something that government can deliver on its own, or does it need help from others? And if you get a no and a no, and lots of questions are like that, that's what I would call a wicked issue, you'll find out this is the only way you can solve it. But if you get a yes and a yes, you're going to find out that actually it's a pretty conventional issue, and there still are lots of conventional issues.
Thank you. Good.
I like the fact that you've explained this as a very complex situation. I just want to ask a practical question, a question about tactics. If I'm an individual or an interest group and I have identified a problem that I believe there's should be some solution to, where do I start? Do I go to government? Do I start collaborating? What's the best way to
Well, of course, it'll depend on
issues?
at least two things. One is what government you're dealing with. As I just mentioned, governments are more or less open to this. Not to be unkind, folks, but I will just say this, is if we look, for example, right now in the federal government, there's almost no openness to this. There just isn't, right, at the political level. On the other hand, you go somewhere in some of the smaller provinces, there's a lot of openness, and that could change. So the first thing is, how open is the government to dealing with this? And the second one, obviously, just following up on the last question, is what's the issue and how much progress have we made on engagement? I would say this, if you're starting from scratch, in other words, it's an issue that there isn't a lot of sort of collaboration going on around, I think the first stages of this are something like in part what we're doing right here today, or I just came from a meeting with a bunch of officials from the recreation sector across the country, including governments and organizations, where they start to come together and ask themselves, how do we begin to align ourselves as a community without taking away the ability to do things on the ground separately and differently than we do, and actually begin to articulate our voice as a community in a way that governments not only will listen to, but will want to listen to because it helps them solve problems. I think the first thing is you got to get your voice together and tell a story together in numbers that makes your case important, credible, and adds a solution, not a problem, helps solve the problem for governments.
Thank you.
I'd like to characterize perhaps the contrast between the old working model and the new working model, or the emerging working model, as one similar to parenting a child as opposed to parenting an adolescent and hopefully dealing with adults. And I'm not sure where we are in the stage, if we're still at the adolescent stage and we're in that uncomfortable zone, moving to that. But my question is more about if engineers or other technicians or whoever's in the technical space is going to be engaged in these kinds of collaborative processes now with a whole variety of other interest groups, other consumers, the public, players in the space. What kinds of attitudes and skills do they need, as those technical people need to bring into those fora to be able to advance the causes, to be able to listen, and to shape durable solutions?
Excellent question. First of all, let me just say on your analogy, let me say that my book, which is called, the last one is Rescuing Policy, the Case for Public Engagement, I was going to call it Government for Grown-ups. I think the analogy is very appropriate. We are, not to be patronizing to the public, I'm part of the public, you are, there is this kind of paternalistic relationship that governments have had with the public. They have taken care of us. They make the decisions for us. We elect them and all that sort of stuff. And the difference is now we're moving through that space where ultimately we've got to do it together. And they're still hanging on to the reins. They're like parents that don't really know how to let go. But to go to your other question, sorry?
Yeah, questions about what kind of skills, attitudes they need to bring to those collaborations. I would say this. Here's
I think that the problem, one of the problems I think about in processes I do dealing with evidence-based scientific knowledge, and your strong suit is evidence-based, right? That's the culture you want to play into, is that we tend to see that as, let me give the pipeline as a good example. Like, I just think it's a horrible example of how we should be having a debate, because it tends to get framed largely as it's supposed to be a question of evidence-based, and then there's this argument about evidence-based for, is it going to create jobs and so on? Evidence-based, is it going to destroy the economy? Destroy the environment. I guess what I want to say is we need to realize that the role evidence plays in our decision-making has got to be a lot more sophisticated interaction with questions about the lifestyle choices, the ways that the question of whether we should build a pipeline or not is not just about jobs versus the environment. It's a question about the risk we want to live with, the kind of lifestyles we want to have, the kind of relationships we want to have to each other. We don't have that discussion, so we just find ourselves polarized. And I guess what I want to say is that the evidence-based part of that, which you guys would bring as engineers to that, is not just to say whether or not we can build a safe pipeline, it's to help us understand what are the options in those range of choices we want to make about risk and lifestyle and other things that become relevant to me as somebody who wants to have that discussion. I think you just have to fit more tightly and more, I guess I'd say more nuanced into that discussion, and that's a more nuanced discussion that we need to have. I'm not sure that's a very good answer, but.
I'm going to have to cut it off there. We've got a tight schedule. We're going to break now for 15 minutes. We'll be coming back with our panel. We'll be starting sharply because we still have a lot to fit in, so thank you very much, Don. Please take care.